Okay. Okay, so we are starting the book of Shemot, and that's a whole new um, era of the Bnei Israel. Now they have turned into an Pharaoh is the first one to call the Bnei Israel, this group of tribes, an a nation.
Yeah.
And from now on, it's going to be about the entire nation Israel, as opposed to the individual families, which is the whole book of Bereshit. Now, our big question here, we're going to handle two things. First of all, we're going to address this issue of Moshe. Moshe is introduced to us in this parsha, and so we're going to ask two questions. Who is Moshe? And two, what qualified him to be chosen? Now, we know, for example, when we talk about Noah, Noah was chosen, and it tells us because he was an Ish Sadiq, Tamim Hayam B'Dorotav, Et
Mhm.
Elohim Hitalech Noah. So he has sort of earned the position of being chosen by God to be saved from the rest of humanity. So that we know. Abraham, if you remember when we learned about him, we didn't know. He didn't have any background, unlike Noah. And we discussed it, and we discussed why there intentionally was no background given to Avram. The first time God meets Abraham, or Abraham meets God, Abraham is 75 years old, and we know nothing about his history. The Midrashim come up with all kinds of stories. I mean, that's not history. Nobody knows really what his background was. And then we explained at that time why God specifically chose him, and there's no background given. Question is with Moshe. We are given a background with Moshe, and it tells us who he was, first of all, and why he was chosen. And this is again, from certainly in Bereshit we saw it, but in Shemot as well. There's a tremendous amount of midrashim, and just to remind you, is midrashim is not the same as pshat.
Mhm.
Pshat is what the text communicates to us, and midrashim is not real history. It's not what the text is saying. It's the rabbis want to teach lessons from the text, so they pick out a text and they teach their own lesson, like a rabbi gives a drush in shul. So it's not the same, and it's very important not to mix up the two. So we are going to answer these questions not based on midrash, but based on what information the text tells us by a close reading of the text. Okay, so let's start. The first thing we know is about his parents, but it's presented in a strange way. There's no name.
Right.
We only know the name later on. It says, Vayelech ish mi beit Levi, vayikach
Mhm.
et bat Levi. So clearly the focus here is where, what tribe they're from.
Levine.
They're full. Moshe is going to be a full-blooded Levi. That is, both
Mhm.
his mother and father are from the tribe of Levi.
Mhm.
Now, so it's telling us to pay attention to Levi. In other words, what do we know about Levi? Okay, so first of all, we know that the parents who are Levim have intentionally become pregnant and decided to have another child within the Pharaoh's decree to kill all boy infants. In other words,
Mhm.
despite that decree, they're going to have another child.
Mhm.
Right.
Here's one of the typical midrashim, as they say that Miriam convinced them and so forth. Okay, that's very nice, but that's what all that it's telling us is that they are uh, people who have this genetic disposition from Levi to take initiative.
Right.
right? That's number one. And then the zealousness against Pharaoh's oppressive decree is not surprising because the spiritual genes of Levi has a strong sense of responsibility to the family and disposition to act in protest. Where do we have that? In the book of Breshit?
With Dinah.
Right, exactly. We refer to Shimon and Levi, who have this strong sense of responsibility to save their sister, and they took actions. Okay. However, you remember, one other characteristic is when Yaakov gives the blessings to all his sons in Vayechi, then Shimon and Levi, he says, their swords are weapons of violence. In other words, he was not very happy. If you remember the original story, he wasn't very happy with Shimon and Levi. I mean, yes, he wanted Dinah to be saved. That's not the issue. But he felt that they overdid it by killing the entire city. And so he says, Yaakov says, let me not enter into their council, let me not join their assembly. In other words, the future of the Jewish people are not going to be characterized by violence. Rather, he says, I will scatter them in Yaakov and disperse them in Israel. In other words, he's not cursing them, but he's saying that their anger needs to be controlled. In other words, to express violence when necessary is understandable, but it has to be within bounds. So just remember that characteristic as we go on further. Then we have another literary allusion. When we have the little story about them putting him in a basket and putting him on the river, Yocheved and Miriam, it says the word tevat gomer. Now, teva is only used one other time in the Chumash.
With Noah and the Mabul.
With Noah, correct. His ship is called a teva. So what literary allusion? In other words, why is the Torah wanting to remind us of the teva of Noah? So since the only other place is this teva, perhaps the Torah is using the literary tool of a word association to hint to us that just as Noah was chosen to lead humanity to a new level of relationship with God, remember he and his family started humanity again, while corrupted life perished in the water, everybody else perished. In microcosm, Moshe is destined to lead the Hebrew nation to a new relationship with God, from slavery to a free nation, while the oppressors perish in water, in the Sea of Reeds. So in other words, there's an interesting literal association between these two incidences. But this is the way the Torah works. Remember, it's made to remind the listener of things, and when you get a word that only appears elsewhere, the Torah is telling you, make the association between the two.
In both cases, they're entering stormy waters that will be full of conflict.
Right? Correct. So it's a third association. Okay? So now, but in other words, it's a microcosm, though. In other words, Moshe is going to sort of be the Noah of the Jewish people. Okay, what about his name? He's called Moshe. Now, how did he receive his name?
But Pharaoh gave it to him. He mashcha oto or something from the water. He was drawn from the water.
So so the question is first of all, who named him? Bat Paro, not his parents. Okay.
Right.
Now,
if
Bat Paro is naming him, it should be an Egyptian name.
Right.
Right? Because she doesn't know Hebrew. So it's Egyptian name. And so when it says Vatomer ki min hamayim mishitihu, it doesn't mean that she named him Moshe from the Hebrew word mishitihu, even though the letters are the same, because she's not speaking Hebrew. She's speaking Egyptian. And this idea was explained by the Netziv. The Netziv was a contemporary of Hirsch, elsewhere though in Russia. And he came up with this explanation. He says, since Pharaoh's daughter saved him from death and raised him, she considered him her own child. In other words, when a person saves another, when an adult saves an infant from death, that infant becomes the child of the one who saved it.
Mm-hmm.
That was a ancient Near East convention. Okay, so the fact that she saved him, she considered him her own child, and so now we have an Egyptian source because MS. Remember the mem and the sheen, or the mem and a sin, in Egyptian means son, like Ramses. Ramses, Ramses. The Mses means son, and Ra is the god, Ra, the sun god. So the Egyptian Pharaoh is the son of Ra, the sun god, and he's called Ramses. So the Mses means son of. So Moses is an Egyptian name meaning son of. So, and in the second phrase, she explains why he is her child. In other words, why is he now considered her own child? Because I saved his life. I drew him from the water. Okay, so in other words, it's an explanation. It's not an explanation of his name. It's an explanation of the reason that he is now considered her child.
Right.
And that's what happens. That Yochebed is the nursemaid, but she has to give him back to Bat Paro, and he is raised in Bat Paro's house, in Pharaoh's house, which is very important because and it tells us something about him. In other words, one of the qualifications of Moshe is that he was raised in Pharaoh's house, because there, as a prince, he is tutored and he learns how to speak Egyptian, which he's going to need later on, because the slaves, may know street language of Egyptian, but they wouldn't be able to have a conversation with Pharaoh or his councils. Number two, he learns also how to read and write and to speak rhetoric. In other words, he's learning the skills he's going to need as, number one, the representative of the Jewish people to Pharaoh, and number two, afterwards, he's going to be the one who has to know how to read and write. He is going to be the one to record the Torah. Okay?
Right, but
If he was a
yes,
slave, and raised as a slave, and God chose him among the slaves, he would have no opportunity to learn any of these skills. They
Steve,
didn't.
if he's learning rhetoric, yet he is very reticent to use that rhetoric. He feels he can't. He's not capable.
Correct. He goes with this whole back and forth between him and God, but that's out of humility and out of not understanding. I mean, remember, this is his first. If you think back, it's his first introduction to God at the burning bush. He doesn't know. He's never had any connection to God, and he's old. I mean, he's spent 30 years or so in Midian. And so he's also 75. when God meets him at the bush and introduces himself and tells Moshe what's going on. So this is, Moshe has no idea of why he was chosen or what he's supposed to do, and it's understandable that he is going to be very, very hesitant to be a representative of this God to Pharaoh, who is the the king of the most powerful country in the world. So that's understandable. Okay, but yes, he's saying that I don't have an innate ability to be articulate and express myself and persuade Pharaoh like I should be. And God said, don't worry about it. If you remember the conversation, God says, don't worry, because I'm going to be with your mouth and I'm going to tell you what to say. In other words, don't uh, don't not believe in yourself. Believe that I'm going to be behind you. I've got your back, and I'll tell you what to say, and I will help you express it so that it serves my purposes. And finally, Moshe, to up to the end, he didn't want to give in. I mean, he just feels he can't promise to do it. He doesn't want to let down God. He doesn't want to let down his people. And so God has to get angry with him at the end. Not so angry, but he has to get sort of frustrated with Moshe, and he says, "Okay, I'll I'll use your brother Aaron, who speaks. It's not to speak to Pharaoh, because Aaron doesn't know the kind of Egyptian you need to speak to Pharaoh. Moshe is going to be the one, since he knows Egyptian, to speak to Pharaoh. But Moshe was very concerned that the people are not going to believe him. And so it's Aaron's job to talk to the people in order to convince and persuade his own people, because he speaks their language and he comes from them, that God is going to save them. So there are two groups here that's going on, and we're going to come back to that issue. There are two groups. One is Moshe's relationship to Pharaoh, and the other is Moshe and Aaron's relationship to the people, to his own people. Okay, so now we have more information about Moshe's character, and each event that's described in a very quick succession. Each event gives us more information about Moshe's character and why he was chosen by God. So the first incident is now Moshe is a young adult, probably about 18, 19 years old, that he grew up in Pharaoh's house. And now he goes out, but look at the text. He went out to where his own people were. In other words, he identifies the Hebrew slaves as his own people. Now, most likely, Miriam and Yocheved or Amram were tutoring him in Bat Paro's house. In other words, Bat Paro was not negative against the Hebrew people. It's her father who was the problem. But she was a rebel. She saved his life when her father said you have to kill all baby boys, and so she is open to Moshe retaining his identity as a Hebrew. Still, she considered him her child, but he is a Hebrew child. And so he goes out as a young adult, 18, 19 years old, and he goes to, the Torah describes it as where his own people were. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. The Torah text is stressing the fact that Moshe is considering the Hebrews his own people, and he is one of them. So he looks this way and that, and there's nobody around. And so he smote the Egyptian and hit him in the sand. Now, it's not for nothing that we have this preface, glancing this way and that and seeing there was no man. Why is that important? Because remember his characteristic. His characteristic of Levi is to act impulsively, which he is doing, but unlike Levi, he is not going to overreact, as Yaakov was afraid of. Okay? What he's going to do is first look and see that there wasn't anybody around, and then he struck the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. Okay, so in other words, it's an example of modifying his balance of his zealotry in defense of his brethren, which is the
when you
sort of a
yeah, but
teaching of Levi.
excuse me, Steve.
Yeah,
Question, but when you say he's balancing, what else could he have done? He did everything that he
right. So it's not
has
that
a
he didn't.
balance.
Well, he smote the Egyptian, but he cared that he didn't do it as an impulsive on the spot. He looked this way and that. He hesitated to make sure that he wasn't being seen, so that he's going to do the act. He's going to save the Hebrew, but he didn't. But he's going to do it in a thought out way, as opposed to the Shimon and Levi way of going out and just killing everybody and not caring what's going on. So in other words, that was Yaakov's prophetic blessing to Levi, is that retain your zealotry, but do it in a controlled fashion. And so we're told in that line that he's doing this in a controlled fashion. Then we have the next story. He sees now two Hebrews fighting each other and arguing with each other. So he goes up to the one who is in the wrong and says, "Why are you hitting your fellow Hebrew?" And the man says, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me like you killed the Egyptian?" Then Moshe was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." In other words, somebody saw this guy, saw what was going on. But why is this an example and a critical example? Because the Hebrews' reaction to Moshe is the kind of reaction that Moshe is going to have to tolerate for the next 40 years. It's an example of how the Bnei Israel are going to treat Moshe. Who made you a ruler and judge over us? Are you going to kill me? In other words, instead of the man saying, "Oh, you're the one who saved my fellow Hebrew yesterday, thank you," he used sarcasm and accusing and insulting Moshe. And that's what the Bnei Israel are going to do for the next years. And Moshe's reaction could have been, "Hey, I'm a prince of Egypt, and you can't talk to me that way. Why are you insulting me? I can have you hung." Okay, that's not his reaction, and it wasn't his reaction all through the 40 years when he was insulted by the Bnei Israel over and over and over again. He took it all. Every time he took it all, and that was his characteristic that also made him qualified to be the leader of the Bnei Israel, who are going to behave like this Hebrew behaved. His tolerance and humility, especially to ingratitude and insult, uniquely qualified him to deal with the most intractable nation. And what's the third? So when Pharaoh heard, he put out a warrant on Moshe, and Moshe fled from Egypt to Midian and sat down by a well. And the Kohen of Midian had 7 daughters, came to draw water. The shepherds, as they would do to girls, drove them away. But Moshe got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. So there's a third characteristic that's very important. What's the characteristic? And why do we know? What's it reminding us of? So in addition to his assertive Levi character, which we just saw, Moshe also has developed and expressed his Avraham character and also Yaakov character of social concern and kindness to strangers. Remember, Yaakov at the well did the same thing with with Rivka, with Rachel. Remember, she came in, she was watering the flock, and she was bullied, and Yaakov
Yes.
saved her. So it's the same characteristic of being concerned for others, not even people you know. These were not Hebrews. In Moshe's case, it was Midianites. In Abraham's case, it was strangers who happened to be passing through that he took care of them. And in
Right.
Yaakov's case, it was somebody he didn't know until after the fact that she was related to his family. So all these three things are giving us characteristics of why God chooses Moshe, because he deserved to be chosen. In other words, he's eligible. He is the one who inherently has the character that can be successful at affecting God's big plans. Now, here's a very interesting thing. We're going to look at the text first, and then we're going to go back and ask the big questions. So, what is the first contact at the bush between Moshe and God? God is explaining to Moshe what his plan is. He's going to tell Moshe that I'm going to take this people out, and I'm going to fulfill the promise of bringing them into the land that I promised to the ancestors. And then God continues and says, but the elders of Israel, and then he says, the elders of Israel will listen to you, but then you and the elders should go to the king of Egypt and to say, God, the God of the Hebrews, has met with us, which is true. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to God. That was the first instruction. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to our God. What did God not say? What could have God told them to tell Pharaoh? I mean, given God's plan, what could he have told Moshe to say to Pharaoh the first time they meet?
God said, let my people go.
Right? We would expect him to say, let my people go. In other words, free the Hebrews. Okay? Pay attention. We will see that God and Moshe never say that to Pharaoh. In the entire story, they never say, let my people go free. They always say this line, let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices. And then afterwards, Moshe and Aaron go to Pharaoh and they say, let my people go so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Not to go free, but to hold a festival to me in the wilderness. Then Pharaoh's reaction is understandable. Who is this God that I should obey him and let Israel go to worship? I don't know this God, and I'm not going to let them go in the wilderness. I'm not going to let them take a break for 3 days. Then they said, the God of the Hebrews has met with us. Let us take a 3-day journey into the wilderness to offer sacrifices to God our God, or he may strike us with plagues or with a sword. That's the language that Pharaoh understands, that if a God is angry at you, he is going to punish you. So Moshe and Aaron are using the same kind of language and saying, look, let the Hebrews go for 3 days because their God is going to become angry if they don't worship him for 3 days. He's trying to convince him and persuade him to let the people go using his own language. Okay, but then God says, Pharaoh is not going to listen to you. Then I will lay my hand on Egypt with mighty acts of judgment, and I will bring out my divisions, my people in the net. Then again, this is to Moshe and Aaron, not to Pharaoh. Then I'm going to punish the Egyptians and bring my people out, And the Egyptians will know that I am God when I stretch out my hand against Egypt and bring the Israelites out of it. Okay? So in other words, it's against it, the purpose of saying saying a 3-day worship in the wilderness is in order for Pharaoh not to listen, and in order for God to bring the plagues, and each plague, we're not going to, have time to go over that, but each plague is directed at one of the gods of Egypt. The Nile is a god of Egypt. The fertility, the frog is a god of Egypt. The bugs are a god of Egypt. All of these are different gods of Egypt. Certainly, darkness is against the sun god Ra, and so all these are each plague is against the Egyptians, but it's simultaneously against the different gods of Egypt in order for God to show that He is, in fact, the God of the universe and not these Egyptian gods have no power. Okay, but notice,
Steve,
yeah,
wouldn't you think Pharaoh would be actually happy to get rid of them since he was
no,
afraid of them?
we'll see, Hold on. So look, I'm excerpting lines in chapter 7, 2 times in chapter 9, and then in chapter 10, and each time it's the same phrase. Tell him to say, God, the God of the Hebrews, has sent me to say to you, let my people go so they may worship me in the wilderness. And then 2 chapters later, after more plagues, let my people go so they may worship me. And after more plagues, let my people go so they may worship me. And then in chapter 10, let my people go so they may worship me. In other words, it's the same line over and over and over again. Freedom to let them, to free the slaves are never requested. Now, Pharaoh's reaction to these plagues are like negotiations with Hamas. He's saying,
Mm-hmm.
Pharaoh says, well, I'll let you go to offer sacrifice, but A, you can't go very far. And Moshe says, well, we're going to have to go far. We are going to have to go 3 days with our young and our old, our sons and daughters with our flocks. And Pharaoh said, no, I'm not going to let you go along with your women and children. Clearly, you are bent on evil. No, only the men can go. Everybody else has to stay here. All your flocks, all your families have to stay in Egypt. Okay, and then Moshe says, there's more plagues. And then Pharaoh says, okay, then I'll let your women and children go, but you have to leave your flocks and herds. In other words, he's always afraid. He wants to assure that after 3 days they're going to come back. And Moshe says, no, that's no good either, because we have to make sacrifices. We have to take our flocks with us. So we're not accepting the deal yet. We have to take not only all our families, but we have to take all our flocks with us as well. And then finally, on the 10th plague, during the night, Pharaoh says to Moshe and Aaron, get out of here, you and the Israelites, go take everything, go worship your God as you have requested, take your flocks, your herds, as you have said, and go. And then he was so surprised to hear when the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, in other words, they're not coming back, he was shocked. He was convinced that they were going to come back. Okay, and now he's heard that they're not, and so he says, well, what have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services. In other words, they're escaping. No, he never expected that they are going to leave. He believed they were going to come back from 3 days, and that was his plan, and he was shocked to hear that they have fled. One other piece of information, and then we're going to put that together. Look at these 3 lines when the night before the Bnei Israel are leaving. The Egyptians pressured the people to hurry and leave the country. In other words, not only Pharaoh, but all the Egyptians wanted to get rid of the Hebrews, not to let them go free, but to let them leave Egypt for 3 days, let them go into the desert for 3 days. And because they said, otherwise we're going to die. So the people took their dough before the yeast was added, carried it on their shoulders and their kneading troughs. In other words, the people, the Hebrew word for the description all the way through as v'garshem min haaretz, they were expelled from the land. In other words, Pharaoh and the Egyptians expelled them. They pushed them out. They pressured them to leave in a hurry, and that's why they couldn't wait for dough to rise. They had to take the raw dough on their back, and they'll have their kneading troughs with them, and they'll do it some other time, but they can't do it now. And then the Israelites did as Moshe instructed, and they asked the Egyptians to borrow articles of silver and gold. Why to borrow? Because they're expected to come back. In other words, the Bnei Israel expected that all of this is going to be for a 3-day journey. They were never told they're going to be free. They didn't believe it. They were told. Next week, we'll see in the beginning of Parshat Vayera, they're told that God is going to take them out and bring them to the land, and it says they didn't believe it. They didn't believe it. Right? And so they believed that they were going to at least have a 3-day holiday. And so they took some dough with them and their kneading troughs, and they were going to bake the bread during this 3-day holiday. And meanwhile, they're told their Egyptian neighbors that they're going to borrow jewelry and clothing because this is going to be a big party. It's going to be a festival, a festive vacation. So they need festival clothing and they need jewelry. And God had made the Egyptians favorably disposed towards the people, and they gave them what they asked for. But the Bnei Israel assumed that they're going to have to give it back after 3 days. So here's the big question. Why did God, through Moshe, only ask Pharaoh permission to go 3 days to worship from the very start? We saw it in the text. From the very start, when he introduced his plan to Moshe, he said, you're going to ask Pharaoh for only 3-day holiday. Why didn't he demand that Pharaoh let his people go from bondage to freedom? Why didn't he just say to Pharaoh, free my people, or else bad things are going to happen to you? He didn't do that. Why didn't he do that? That's the big question. So look at it from Pharaoh's perspective. How did the slavery first come about? Right, the beginning of the Parsha, when it described how the Israelites became slaves in the first place. Pharaoh said to his people, the Israelites have become far too powerful for us, far too numerous for us. There's too many of them. We have to deal shrewdly with them, where they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, will join our enemies and fight against us and leave the country. In other words, he was afraid of an internal rebellion, A, and B, that the Israelites are going to be a fifth column. They're going to join the Semites to overtake the Egyptian dynasty. Now, why was he afraid of that? Because it just happened a generation before. Pharaoh was afraid to let the people go in the desert, lest they joined other Semitic tribes and attacked the monarchy, as did the Hyksos. If you know your history, the Egyptian monarchy was conquered by Semites called the Hyksos. And they took over, which explains, by the way, why Pharaoh of Yosef, Pharaoh of Yosef was a Hyksos. He was a Semite. He wasn't an Egyptian. He wasn't part of the Egyptian dynasty. He was the ruler of Egypt by the conquered Semites, and he was then more likely to allow Yosef, who he knew was a Hebrew, as a Semite, to become the viceroy of Egypt, because they were in charge. This Pharaoh was a Semite, not an Egyptian. Okay, so the Pharaoh after the Hyksos was after the Egyptian dynasties defeated the Semites and drove them out. But meanwhile, they were afraid that they're going to come back. So Pharaoh was afraid to let the people go because they will join the Semites. So he insisted they always leave some people or possessions behind. That's why he kept saying, first your wife and children, then your cattle, leave so you're going to come back, because he was afraid they might hook up with the Semites and then lead a rebellion against the Egyptian dynasty.
Right.
Okay.
Very good.
So had God asked for freedom from slavery to leave Egypt, initially, there wouldn't be any discussion with Moshe and Aaron. Think of it. Moshe and Aaron came and said, let these people go. Given that he's afraid that they're going to join the Semite enemy, he would say, go, kill these two people who are planning to overthrow me. And he would just have them killed immediately. And then there would be no plagues, and the whole story would never happen. So he couldn't say that. The only thing that Pharaoh could listen to is a possibility of give them a 3-day holiday. Then there's a negotiation. But there's no negotiation if Moshe went to them and to him and said, free the Hebrews. There's no way he could free the Hebrews. Okay? And which is why he made sure he kept them. He assured they're coming back, because he was afraid that if they would leave, they would join the enemies. So that's why we had this throughout the entire thing, was about a 3-day holiday and never about freeing the Hebrew slaves. Now, what about the Jewish perspective? What would the people's reaction be if Moshe, on God's orders, told the people that they're going to escape from Egypt and go into Canaan? Okay, the text tells us in the next week's Parsha, when Moshe said that to them, they didn't believe it. They said they didn't want to go. There are over 2 million people we're talking about, the Hebrews in Egypt. There is no water or food in the desert. And they were living on the Nile Delta with plenty of water, and they were provided with fish and vegetables. We know that because they said so.
Yeah,
Right?
right. Moshe was reminded of that quite a few times.
Exactly. And they knew that there's nothing in the desert. Okay? How could they find, if God was promising to give them the land of Canaan, how are they going to fight the Canaanites when they arrive there? They're a slave nation. They don't know how to fight. So there was no way that they wanted to leave. Why should they leave a place where there's no water to a place where there's no water and there's no food, while they have plenty of water and food, and while they could not possibly fight the Canaanites? And remember, God also agreed in Parshat Shemot. God said, I'm not leading the people up to Canaan, which is the shortest route, because they're going to get scared and they're going to run back to Egypt. God says that. He knows that they're going to do that.
It was preferable to be slaves and do the slave labor.
Exactly. Okay, so what they thought is what Pharaoh thought. The only reason that they agreed to leave Egypt, is that they were going to be allowed 3 days of respite from harsh slavery and then return. In other words, they also believe they're going to return. Because if they thought that they were going to go out in the desert and they're never going to go back, they wouldn't go in the first place. If they thought Moshe was to take them to Canaan, they too would not have listened to him from the start. Okay, and we have supporting text to this. Moshe reported this plan to the Israelites. This is the next week's Parsha, but they did not listen to him because of their discouragement and harsh labor. They only knew the life of slavery, and they didn't want to hear about being freed and having to somehow survive in the desert. When Pharaoh let the people go, this is in Beshalach that I just mentioned, he didn't lead them through the Philistine country, which was straight up north. Where Ashkelon, Ashdod, Gaza. He didn't lead them that way because if they face war, says God, they're going to change their minds and run back to Egypt. So he led them south toward the Red Sea, not north towards Canaan. And then 3 days after they were freed, the first thing they said is to Moshe, was it because there are no graves in Egypt that you brought us here to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone? Let us serve the Egyptians. It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in this desert without any food or water. In other words, they didn't want to leave. And that explains, by the way, why that word is used over and over again. Vayigarshu mimitzrayim. They were expelled from Egypt. Had they not been expelled, they wouldn't have left. That's why the symbol of matzah, that Rabban Gamliel says on the Seder night, you have to know what the symbol of matzah is. He brings the pasuk, Ki garshu mimitzrayim v'lo yachlu lehitmameya. They were expelled and they couldn't tarry even if they wanted to. But they wanted to. They'd rather stay there. And in fact, the Navi, much later on in history, when he's recounting Yetziat Mitzrayim through prophecy, says, you didn't want to leave. God forced you out for his own name, not because you deserved it and not because you wanted to leave, but because God has his plan and he forced you out of Egypt. And most of the people stayed in Egypt. The people that came out are only a fraction of the people that were in Egypt. Most of them stayed there and remained slaved and simply assimilated and disappeared from the Jewish people because it made no sense to them to leave. And they were only those who are, the Egyptians made them leave. The Egyptians forced them out. And that's why the verb is used over and over again. By Yigarshu, that's what we said before. In the 10th plague, the Egyptians wanted them to get out quickly. They thought they were all going to die. They threw them out. Had they not thrown them out, they wouldn't have left. It made no sense to them to leave.
It's interesting, Steve, that they were so great in number, and yet their fear was so strong. They were afraid, even though they were outnumbering the Egyptians, that they still were afraid of them.
Well, they weren't outnumbering them. They weren't outnumbering. There are millions and millions and millions of Egyptians. This is the Bnei Israel were just one slave nation among a number of slave nations under Egyptian rule. So they were not more numerous than the Egyptians. They were potentially going to be more powerful than the dynasty, and that's what they were afraid of. If they're more powerful, they're going to join the enemy, and then they're going to overthrow them. So the mission of Moshe in Egypt was twofold. A, to demonstrate to Egypt, which was the world power, that it and its gods are not the ultimate power in the world. This is for the purpose of all the Canaanite nations and Egypt itself to know that the God of the Hebrews is the ultimate power of the earth and the heavens. And in the Shira, when we sing the Az Yashir, it says that all the nations saw what the God of the Hebrews did to Egypt, and they were all frightened of the Bnei Israel. Okay,
He's
so,
introducing monotheism.
right, and but monotheism in terms of being the God of the Hebrews, that there is one God who is stronger than all of their gods. If they're stronger than the gods of Egypt, they're certainly going to be stronger than the gods of Canaan.
Mm-hmm.
And the second is to demonstrate to the Bnei Israel that God keeps his promise to their forefathers to create a nation of Israel and bring them to the land promised to Abraham, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. So that there was a dual purpose throughout this whole thing. One was to punish Egypt and to show that the Hebrew God is the ultimate power of the universe, and the second to show the Bnei Israel that its God keeps his promise and is going to bring this nation called Am Yisrael into the land promised to their ancestors. So he's teaching both groups of people through this whole experience of the slavery in Egypt. The first is demonstrated by the plagues in the Exodus, and the second is the rest of the 4 books. So next week, we're brought to a dramatic point because Moshe goes to Pharaoh. This is before all the plagues. Moshe goes to Pharaoh and says, let my people go for 3 days. And Pharaoh's reaction is, I don't know this God, like we saw, and I'm not letting you go. And I'm even making it worse. You're going to have to collect all the materials to make bricks that you're doing, and you're going to even though you're going to have to spend hours and hours every day collecting the materials, the amount of bricks that you make is going to remain the same as you have been doing, and therefore you're going to have to work, not 8 hours a day. You're going to have to work 14 hours a day. And so the Bnei Israel went to Moshe and they said, hey, this isn't fair. You said you're going to help us. And Moshe agrees with them. And he goes to God and he says, Hashem, why have you brought trouble upon this people? Is this why you sent me? Ever since I went to Pharaoh to speak in your name, he's brought more trouble upon this people, and you have not rescued your people at all. In other words, Moshe is completely frustrated. And he says, you told me your plan, you told me you're doing, I did what you told me to say, and now you made it even worse. So what's going on? And of course, what does God say? Don't worry, wait, just watch. Watch what's going to happen. Okay, so
Very good. So do you plan on doing next week?
yes, we're going